From the heartland of America and the gateway to the West, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. This is Coast to Coast AM. Later tonight, near-death experiences. Here's what's happening. Convicted killer Joran Vandersloot has confessed to the slaying of Natalie Holloway, according to a federal judge in Alabama who accepted his guilty plea in an extortion case targeting her family. According to a transcript of his confession, Vandersloot shared a grisly account of the teen's final moments. He admitted that he crushed her head with a cinder block, dragged her to the ocean, and dumped her when she refused his advances on an Aruba beach. Jeez. Fears that the Gaza war could trigger a wider and more devastating Middle East war are growing as clashes with Iranian-backed Hezbollah intensified along Israel's northern border with Lebanon, and Israel presses ahead with its plans for a ground incursion into Gaza aimed at destroying Hamas. The fears spiked following a strike on a Gaza hospital that appears to have killed hundreds of people, triggering and just very angry denunciations and calls for vengeance across the region. Demonstrators took to the streets in the West Bank, marched to the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, converged on Israeli diplomatic missions in Turkey and Jordan, blaming the strike on Israel, which has obviously denied any responsibility for that, blaming Hamas. Howard Bloom is looking into this story for us. Howard, a bad situation for everybody now.
Okay, first, to understand this, there's a Muslim phrase you have to know, and it's, we love death more than you love life. And keep that in mind as we do the latest news on the Israel-Hamas war. Israel has vowed, as you know, to demolish Hamas, to render the organization incapable of any more barbaric attacks like the one that decapitated babies, burned people alive, killed 1,400 Israeli citizens, and took 199 hostages on October 7th. Israel has been bombing Hamas facilities in Gaza ever since. And Hamas and its fellow terrorist group, Islamic Jihad, have been raining rockets on civilians in Israel every day since then. Meanwhile, on Monday, October 16th, it was announced that Joe Biden would brave the rockets and would fly to Israel to meet with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's war cabinet. Then Biden would travel to Jordan to meet with Jordan's king, with Egypt's president, and with the head of the Palestinian Authority to reduce the odds that the war, a war started by Hamas, would not spread to the entire Middle East. But one day after this announcement, yesterday, the precise day before Biden was due to touch down in Israel, the Al-Ali Baptist Hospital in Gaza City blew up. This was exactly what Hamas was hoping for. Within minutes of the bombing, Hamas blamed the loss of what it said were 500 lives on Israel, and that claim was echoed as truth all over the world. However, Israel kept quiet. It analyzed the data carefully, and roughly 24 hours later, Israel concluded that the explosion had been caused by a rocket from the terror group Islamic Jihad, a rocket that had failed early in its flight and had exploded in the parking lot of the hospital, a parking lot where hundreds of civilians fleeing the bombing had set up camp, which is why so many people were killed. The nature of the explosion was one proof that this was a Muslim missile. The explosion was the kind that would be made by a rocket that had only gone a short distance and was still full of fuel, then blew up not just the warhead's explosives, but the fuel itself. Experts were able to show this in cell phone videos of the explosion. Then there was the fact that the explosion did not dig a crater, something a bomb from the Israelis would have done. And there was Israel's ability to pinpoint the location from which the rocket had been launched, a cemetery near the hospital. What's more, there was an intercepted conversation between two Hamas members discussing the damage the Islamic Jihad rocket had done, and the fact that the last thing Israel would want to do on the day before the President of the United States was about to visit was explode a hospital. Tonight, America's intelligence agencies agreed that the explosion was caused by a failed Islamic Jihad rocket. But the distraction of the hospital explosion did exactly what Hamas wanted it to do. Yep. It helped Hamas turn the world against Israel. But more about that in a minute. It also led to the cancellation of Joe Biden's meeting with Arab leaders. Meanwhile, early this morning, Joe Biden arrived in Tel Aviv and met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's war cabinet. Biden was disturbed by a problem. Israel was stopping all humanitarian aid to Gaza to pressure Hamas to release its 199 hostages. However, thanks to Biden's intercession, Israel changed its mind, and Egypt agreed to let 20 trucks of humanitarian aid through its passage into Gaza, the Rafah border crossing. The condition is that none of this aid goes to Hamas, and that will be a difficult condition to fill. In the past, Hamas has grabbed relief supplies meant for civilians and used them to feed its terrorists. Meanwhile, Hamas is telling Gaza City citizens not to escape to the south. There's a reason. Hamas has built 311 miles of military tunnels under Gaza City, and Hamas stores its ammunition in schools, mosques, and hospitals. Why? To use civilians as human shields, to make sure that if Israel bombs Hamas targets, civilians will die, and the deaths of those civilians will be victories for Hamas. They will be used as propaganda to demonize Israel.
Howard's website is howardbloom.net. He's got full information on there. Thanks, Howard. Amazon will soon make prescription drugs fall from the sky when the e-commerce giant becomes the latest company to test drone deliveries for medications. The company said that customers in College Station, Texas, can now get prescriptions delivered by a drone within an hour placing their order. The drone, programmed to fly from a delivery center with a secure pharmacy, will travel to the customer's address, descend to a height of about 13 feet, and drop a padded package down. Unbelievable technology. The Biden administration is reducing the types of semiconductors that American companies will be able to sell to China, citing that desire to close loopholes in existing regulations announced last year. Mish, what does this all mean? Mish Shedlock's with us.
George, I don't like it. A lot of people are probably going to cheer this, but I think it's going to backfire. Generally, these trade wars do. What happened is the Biden administration increased sanctions last year. NVIDIA produced a chip specifically for China that would get around those restrictions. So what did the administration do but ban those chips too? Now, this comes from the Bureau of Industry and Security, and I wonder how many people even knew we had such a department, but we do, and they're trying to curb these exports. They specifically mentioned China in the report itself and ban, and then, of course, other rogue nations like Iran and you know, generally Russia, of course. But we tried this before, George. We banned 5G chips, and then China started its own factory. Now, its technology is at least 2 generations behind what the U.S. can do, maybe 3, but China wasn't supposed to be in the ballpark at all. Now it's producing chips good enough for most 5G purposes. This impacted Qualcomm, which lost 60 million chipset orders as soon as China was able to get this technology up. So we had a temporary victory. Now, China has already reacted by cut off 2 rare earth materials that are used in wind turbines, in production of computer chips, in military equipment. And China has 80% of either these rare earth metals or produces them, at least 80% of almost all of them. I fear that it's going to react by cutting off materials we need for electric batteries, for our own military equipment. And these sanctions just don't work, George, so you can hear the frustration in my voice, but that's the path we're heading down.
It could get ugly. Thanks, Mish. Appreciate it. In a moment, Maurice Cotterell back with us. We're going live to Ireland to talk about the sun, sunspots, and how it affects all of us next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Maurice Cotterell back with us, author, engineer, scientist. Back in 1989, while working at Cranfield University as head of electrical and communications engineering, he found a way of calculating the duration of magnetic reversals on the sun. And using this knowledge, he was able to break the secret codes of ancient sun-worshipping civilizations and understand how the sun affects life on Earth. Maurice, welcome back. Always great having you on the show.
Thank you, George. Nice to be back.
How have you been?
I've been okay. And you?
I'm doing well, too. What's your latest book, by the way? I have Future Science, but I have a feeling you've written a few more since we've talked.
I've written another one called The Secret Messiah, which is about the life and times of Leonardo da Vinci and how he was a miracle maker and a very special person. And it's a very special book, and it's available from my website.
Excellent. Well, let's talk a little bit about the sun and tell us what your latest investigation has uncovered.
Well, let's talk about what sunspots are first, George, because many people are not familiar with the subject. They are actually dark spots on the sun's surface, which appear over a visible cycle of about 11 and a half years, depending on how many cycles are used to make the calculation. The ancient Chinese were aware of the cycles from as early as around 3000 BC. These spots are called what is known as, they're caused by the differential rotation of the sun's magnetic fields. There are two magnetic fields on the sun. A dipole magnetic field extends from north to south, and an equatorial magnetic field is equally spaced around the equatorial region. Now, all of the sun spins every 40 days or thereabouts, just over 40 days, except the equator of the sun, which is pulled around more quickly by the orbiting planet Mercury, which orbits the sun just about every 88 days. And that causes the equatorial region of the sun to move 4.1 degrees a day more quickly around the sun. So although the poles continue to spin every 40 days, the equator spins every 28 days to an observer on Earth. This is why the rotational rate of the sun is referred to as that differential rotation, because its rate of spin varies with latitude. And the spinning causes distortion of the polar bar magnetic field, which winds up over a period of about 11 to 11.5 years, causing the manifestation of magnetic blisters to break out from the solar surface. The highly magnetic regions prevent sunlight from leaving the sun up just above each blister, which then appears as a dark spot relative to the background solar radiation. Now, the spots appear at higher solar latitudes at the beginning of each cycle, and they migrate towards the solar equator as the cycle progresses. Now, when I was at Cranfield in 1989, I found a way of calculating the duration of sunspots using a method I call rotational differentiation. And there are several cycles. The fundamental cycle is 11.49 years, but this sits on top of a longer 187-year cycle. The two mix together to produce 5 solar magnetic shifts over a period of 18,139 years. Now, the exact duration of the cycles was also known by the sun-worshipping Maya of Central America more than 1,500 years ago.
How did they know this, Maurice? How did they know this?
Well, it perplexed me for many years how they could have known. But several books later, I became to realize that, in fact, it wasn't the Maya civilization that was super intelligent. It was the leader of the Maya civilization, Lord Paikal. And Lord Paikal was the reincarnation of Jesus. He was a miracle maker. And he's been to Earth many times over the last 5,000 years of our present cosmic cycle. And it was the leader who passed on this information to his people and encoded it into his treasures so that later generations like ourselves could understand the scientific side of sunspots, but also the spiritual side, because there are two sides to this work, and they're all connected. The scientific side, as it says, is scientific, and the spiritual side explains how we get to heaven, why we live, why we die, and why this has to be. And this is how they how they realize that the sun spins every 28 days, and as it spins, it regulates fertility in females. And they knew that during sunspot minimums, more X-rays leave the sun to strike the Earth. And this causes an increase in miscarriages and infant mortality. And they knew that radiation from the sun causes cyclical variations in global temperatures, which results in global warming, global cooling, rainfall, drought, and famine. And they knew that long-term solar magnetic reversals sometimes cause the Earth to tilt on its axis, causing earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, global destruction. And they encouraged us, as I say, all of this knowledge into their treasures for us to discover when we came along.
That's dramatic, Maurice. I never realized how much the sunspots could affect us.
Oh, it is. It's wonderful. And once you get into it, it blows your mind, and it humbles us, I think, because it makes us realize how primitive we are.
What kind of cycle are we on right now?
Well, because we've got the three cycles, 11.5 year, 187 year, and 18,139 year, we have to find out where we are in any one of them to assess just how much radiation is affecting the Earth at this time. Now, we know from sunspot cycles we have an increase in carbon-14 when the sunspot cycle increases, and this affects the growth rings in trees because it affects the growth of trees. And we know from the bristlecone pine that grows in California that old trees go back with a record of about 2,000 years, but coal made from bristlecone pines, you can still read the tree rings off the coal, and they go back as far as 5,000. And right now, we're in the middle of the 11.5-year cycle. So we're actually in the middle. So 5.65 years ago it began, and 5.6 years into the future it will stop. As I say, it sits on top of the 187-year cycle, but that started in around 1900 and will end in about 2087. So we're halfway through the 187-year cycle, which began to dip in about 1993. Now, long-term magnetic reversals can be calculated from the start of the Mayan calendar in 3113 BC. It shifted in 627 AD, which is when the Maya disappeared or began to disappear over the next 100 years.
Coincidentally, right?
Well, they had a sunspot minimum, decreased fertility, increased X-rays, which caused increased miscarriages, lower rainfall, which was accompanied by a drought. So they died, although it was the sunspot minimum that caused the death, they died from starvation. Fortunately, we don't expect the next polar shift, this is when the Earth tilts off its axis, until about 5000 AD. Now, it's not possible to ascertain which part of the 18,000-year cycle we're in. Some observers believe that the current trend in global warming, if it exists, is due to long-term variations in the sunspot cycle, the 18,000-year cycle, whereas others believe it is due to man-made pollution causing greenhouse global warming, but nothing's for certain.
Where does gravity fit into this, Maurice?
Well, in many ways, because the sun not only affects the 28-day fertility cycle, it affects human personality, because it causes 12 different personalities to be created from the solar radiation. What I'm saying here is that because the sun spins differentially, the radiation coming off the sun changes every month, and there are 12 types of radiation during 1 year. 12 codes of radiation come off the sun. And these shuffle up genes at the moment of conception in females, and that creates 12 types of personality. Now, my previous works have explained how the magnetic fields affect how the sun gives off particles which travel to the Earth, and these particles are either positive or negative. They're caused by the solar fusion process as hydrogen is converted into helium inside the sun. Showers of these travel to the Earth in what we call the solar wind and bombard the Van Allen radiation belts, which protect us from solar radiation, and they they envelop the Earth. Now, when these particles impinge upon the Van Allen belts, they go from the Earth's north pole to south pole every 1 second. That changes the Earth's magnetic field at ground level. That causes an increase or decrease in the fertility hormones, estrogen and progesterone. The magnetic fields then shuffle up the genes to create personality changes.
Hold on for a second, Maurice. We're at a break. We'll come back and chat more about the incredible sunspots and gravity. And folks, put your science hats on because we'll take calls next hour. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with Maurice Cotterell. We'll take calls with Maurice next hour here. Maurice, you seem to have your finger on the pulse of how gravity works, where a lot of physicists are still trying to figure it out, scratching their heads. How did you do it?
Well, the reason modern science has been unable to figure it out, George, is because their understanding of the atom is wrong. They imagine the electron to be negative and the proton to be positive, when in fact the electron is negative for only half the time and magnetic for half of the time. So I refer to the electron as an electron magnet. I've written a paper titled How Gravity Works, Why All Bodies Fall to Earth at the Same Speed, and it's available to download from my website for free. Hydrogen's the prime mover in the gravitational mechanism. It is the simplest and most common type of atom in the universe and contains just one positive charge, a proton, and one electromagnetic charge called an electron, or what I call an electron magnet, because it's, as I say, electric for half the time and magnetic for half the time. The electron magnet orbits the hydrogen proton, just like the moon orbits the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
As the electron magnet orbits the proton, it cuts through the electric field between the proton and itself, causing the electromagnet to spin. And the spinning electron magnet then radiates cone-shaped, corkscrew-style radio waves into space. These are what are actually called gravity waves. When these waves strike more complex atoms, they cause those atoms to spin in the same direction. And at the same time, the electron magnets in the complex atom synchronize their spin with the hydrogen electron magnet. The alternating magnetic field between the electron magnets in both atoms then pulls the two atoms closer together. The magnetic field between two atoms alternates 1.42 billion times every second. That's the hydrogen frequency. And it's not possible to detect this with a simple magnetic compass because it's just too high speed. That's why they've not been able to detect it.
What would Albert Einstein say about this if he heard you right now?
Well, he didn't understand at all how gravity works, and I think he'd be scratching his head, to say the very least.
Oh, really? Interesting take on that. How important is gravity, Maurice, to our existence?
It's absolutely crucial, and it's remarkable that we don't understand why objects fall to the ground and we consider ourselves to be intelligent. It affects everything from what we were talking about just before we hit the break. When the DNA is formed, it is the gravity waves in the fluid of water in the DNA, in the cell, that changes the DNA and shuffles the genes up to give us 12 different types of personality. And I also mentioned that earlier that there's two sides to my work, the scientific and the spiritual. And what I've learned is that everything we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell is hell. We are actually living in hell. And this is all created clearly by the Creator, which we call God, in order to purify the souls of mankind. And this, of course, is mentioned in my new book about Leonardo, The Secret Messiah. So it's all interconnected, and it affects every aspect of our lives. It's not just the shuffling of the genes to cause changes in personality, but you see, when now I've written all these books, I realize that the 12 signs of the zodiac are 12 types of mental illness. Now, I know it's 12 types of mental illness, and the traditional understanding of mental illness is all wrong. And I know that too from personal experience. In 2014, I had a heart operation, which was supposed to take 15 minutes to fit a stent. It took 5 hours.
Oh, my God.
And when I got home, 3 days later, I went to bed, and I was bruised. My heart was bruised. It had been pushed and pulled. And I kept waking up at 1 o'clock in the morning, crying, tearfully. And it's not like me at all. I'm not that type of person. And this went on for about 3 or 4 weeks. And I said to my cardiologist, who just happens to be married to a psychiatrist, which is helpful, no doubt, for him, I told him, every time I keep waking up at 1 o'clock in the morning, I said, which means, I've experienced this twice before in my life when I had a broken heart, when I finished relationships with girlfriends, and my heart was broken, I got depressed and tearful. That's the only times in my life I felt that way. And he said he's heard this story many times from many patients. And it occurred to me that depression, therefore, starts in the heart. When your heart is broken, they'd been pushing my heart around for 5 hours during the operation. My heart was broken and I was tearful, which means depression and the so-called mental illnesses are maladies of the heart, not of the mind, which I found was fascinating. So what we find is with the 12 signs of the zodiac, we have 12 types of personality which argue all the time, and that's the way hell has been designed. We're meant to argue all the time. That's why nations speak different languages, so that we misunderstand each other, so there's more scope for conflict. And this is just one of the many mechanisms of hell. There are many mechanisms. Once you stand back to say, hang on a minute, what's going on here? Why have we got all these wars? Because we're living in hell. And when you're living in hell, the thing to do is to escape. It's no good trying to change hell, even though I've done my best over the years. I've tried to explain how hell works and what gravity is and all the rest of it. The thing to do is you've got to it's no good trying to help make better. You've got to actually escape. And to do that, you've got to listen to the ancient sun-worshipping civilizations, miracle makers. As I said, Jesus has been back many, many times during the history of our present cosmic age. And what we've got to do is love our neighbor. Well, in fact, the Old Testament, if you listen to the Old Testament, it says, you've got to love God, Jehovah, with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your might. And then came along Jesus a couple of thousand years later, and he said, you must love your neighbor. And now with my research into ancient civilizations, I would suggest that we have to love every living thing, because every living thing is God in disguise, whether it's a flower or a beetle or a bird. They've all got souls. They're exactly the same as human beings. They just look different. The fact is, all these species are God in disguise. And it's gravity that holds all this together. Gravity is God. God is electromagnetic energy. God is voltage. God is light, as the mystics say. So gravity is of crucial importance to everybody. It's not just the fact that it holds us to the planet, but it also restricts our movements. For example, Isaac Newton gave us the equation for gravity, but he didn't understand how it works. And as a result, he didn't understand that gravity on different planets is a different strength. So gravity, surface gravity on a planet, is the result of the sum total of the gravitational pull from gravity waves from the planet, and this is balanced by centrifugal force from the spinning of the planet, which is trying to throw us off. So the net gravity, it depends on the speed of the spin of the planet. Now, that's not in Isaac Newton's equation. He never knew that. But this is why almost all of the probes sent to Venus have crashed, because gravity is stronger on Venus. Gravity, one day on Venus is like 274 days or thereabouts.
And they never factored that in, did they?
They never factored it in. The same with Mars. 60% of all the probes have crashed on Mars. It's because it only spins a little bit slower, but it's smaller, and that makes a difference as well. So gravity is, we've heard the expression vanity, oh vanity, all is vanity. Well, I've changed that to gravity, oh gravity, all is gravity, because that's what we're actually involved in, this wonderful place called hell, which is so complex and so beautiful that it tells us that we're primitives. That's all we are, primitives, scratching the surface. And I'm glad to say it's been a wonderful journey for me writing all these books, figuring all this stuff out. And they say to know all is to forgive all. And when you forgive all, then you love all. And when you love all, you'll go to heaven.
In 1996, you wrote a book called The Mayan Prophecies. If you were to rewrite it today, Maurice, would it be different from what it was in 96?
Well, it'd be very, very different because it was a very unpleasant experience. The publishers tried to steal the book from me, hook, line, and sinker, and the whole book finished up like a dog's dinner. They did their best to ruin all the illustrations that I'd put in, which were very complex. And the legal bill after it all was I had to pay £40,000, which was about $50,000, and which just about cancelled everything I got from the book. So I was glad to leave it all behind and move on with a new publisher, HarperCollins, with the Super Gods, and that was a lot better, and it went very well. And the books after the Mayan Prophecies I'm pleased with. Even the 2012 thing came from the Mayan Prophecies. That wasn't anything to do with me. That was the publisher. He wanted somebody else to sex up the book because he said it was too scientific, and it was just a complete hoax. The whole 2012 was just a hoax. They tried to say that my work suggested that the world would end in 2012, and it did nothing of the kind.
And I remember on the program that you were with me over many times. You never ever said that.
Well, I don't think I ever had a chance, George. I mean, I'm trying so much to concentrate on the science and the spirituality, and trying to get people on board. It's just difficult, When you've been to a bad place like that, you don't really want to go back. And it's been ever since then, going to Peru and Egypt and all over the world, China, to see all these ancient civilizations. The journey's been worth it. And I now realize that it was meant to be. The only way I could get the book published was to get ripped off, if you like, and to give the work away. This work doesn't belong to me. I've got to give it away. And I've known for years that is my karma. I don't know what it is. Maybe I had my wicked way maybe I was a monk in the previous life and had my wicked way with a nun. I don't know. But this is why it's a very difficult journey, trying to get all this information, which comes to me as I sleep. All this stuff, when I sleep, it all comes through me. Then in the days and weeks and months that follow, I have to figure it out. And then when I've figured it out, that's when I'm overcome with emotion. And I realize that my part in this is a small one, but it's an important one. Like all of us, we have to get this work out and share it. So I don't take the credit for it. It's God's work, not mine.
Well, you do a good job with it, though, Maurice, and you've always done a good job with it.
Well, I try. I try my best.
Let's take a few minutes to tell us about the secret Messiah.
Wow. It's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
How did you key in on Da Vinci?
Leonardo, yes. It all started when I downloaded a photograph. Well, I designed a Christmas card for my wife a few years ago. And ever since then, I've had a screensaver on my computer of Madonna of the Yarn Winder. And after Christmas, I decided to keep it on my screensaver. And this is a picture of Mary holding the baby Jesus in her arms. And the more I looked at it, the more questions it raised in my mind. For example, the baby was leaning to its left, but Mary is trying to restrain it with her right hand about 2 feet away from the baby, which is nowhere near the baby. Also, the baby's body was too long, and his legs were too short. And I know that Leonardo wasn't, so careless. And there's other, the head, the veil of Mary, had a translucent appearance to it. And I thought, I wonder if my decoding process that I used on the Mayas and the Peruvians would work on it. So I put I took a photocopy of the original, made a transparency, a mylar out of it, put one on top of the other as a mirror image. And let's remember that Leonardo was trying to tell us about this because he wrote backwards. And the only way he could read it was with a mirror. So Leonardo was trying to tell us to use this mirror image decoding process on Madonna of the Yarn Winder. Now, a yarn winder, if people haven't heard of it, it's just a stick with a cross at both ends. And when the yarn comes off the spinning wheel, you wrap it in a figure of 8 around this stick called a yarn winder. Now, this tells us that it's trying to tell us that Jesus was the shepherd who led his flock, if you like. And what we learn as we decode, and there's a YouTube video on my website, which is wonderful. It's absolutely beautiful. It's unbelievable. It's only 5 minutes. You must watch it on Madonna of the Yarn Winder. Now, as I began to decode the pictures, I then realized there were certain things that were missing. So I then had to decode Salvator Mundi, which is another Leonardo painting, which was sold by Christie's in 2017 for $500 million.
$500 million? Wow.
$500 million, yeah, plus commission of $50 million. So the buyer had to pay $550. And it was bought by Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and it's since disappeared from public view. Now, it was Salvator Mundi contains the decoding instructions on how to decode Madonna of the Yarn Winder. And when you decode Madonna of the Yarn Winder, it tells us that Jesus was born many times before, and one of the times he was born as Viracocha in Peru. Now, Viracocha it means the foam of the sea.
You wrote a book on that in 2003, right?
That's right. It was The Lost Tomb of Viracocha, and it's about the Peruvian pyramids and the treasures contained in the tomb. And there I decoded the information which told me that Viracocha, one of 2 white gods who walked the lands of Peru, performing miracles in ancient times, was the reincarnation of Lord Pacal of Mexico. So I was able to start building this picture about this being who keeps coming back many, many times throughout history.
Maurice, hold on for a second. We're going to take a short break, but we will come back and chat more with you and take phone calls next.